Often when you're developing APIs, you're going to want to share those APIs with other people, for example, clients that are paying you to use that API. In this video, we're going to look at a Django REST Framework package that allows you to create and share API keys that allow your users to access the API if they have a valid key. So clients will get the API key and they'll send them in the requests to your API. And then your Django server can inspect the API key and determine whether the client has access to the API. So in other words, if you want to deploy your Django API, but you don't want it to be publicly available, you can use this package here. It's called Django REST Framework-api-key in order to restrict that access. So we're going to get started, but before we do, if you want to support the channel, we have this Ko-fi page linked in the description, and any donations are greatly appreciated. Thanks very much to everyone who's contributed. And what we're going to do now is get started with Django REST Framework API key. Now, just to note, we have a full series on Django REST Framework that's coming up soon on YouTube. So this video may get added to that playlist later on, but this is a standalone video and we're going to introduce this package here that allows you to create API keys, but also to share them with users and revoke those keys. For example, if a client stops paying to use your service. So let's have a quick introduction to this package. This provides a powerful library that allows server-side clients to safely use your API. And this is useful if your clients or machines that are using your API don't have a user account, but they still need to interact with the API in a secure way. They still need that data. You can use this approach in order to do that. And it's very simple to use. It's simple to create, view, and revoke API keys. And this package gives you utilities in the Django Admin UI in order to do that. And it's also secure and customizable. So I'm going to get started now by opening VS Code, where I have a very simple Django project and we have a model here called product. Now the model is what we're going to expose through the API. It doesn't really matter what the model is, but this is a product that contains a name, a price, and a Boolean field determining whether it's in stock. And I've already populated the database with some products. So if we open the database.sqlite file, and we can do that using the SQLite extension on VS Code. What I'm going to do is expand this and we're going to look at the product table, and that's core product. If we show the table here, you can see we have 3 products in this table. Now what we want to do is create an API using Django REST Framework, and we want to allow users to get the entire list of these products as an API response, and that's going to be a JSON response. So let's start by seeing how to do that. Now, as I said at the start, we're going to dive into Django REST Framework later in the series, but what I'm going to do for now is install Django REST Framework into this project. So you can do that with the pip install Django REST Framework command. And once that's installed, you can go to your Django project's settings.py file, and down in installed apps, we can add REST_framework to installed apps. So we've added REST Framework to the installed apps. What we're going to do now is we're going to create a serializer in Django REST Framework, and that's going to determine how the product model is converted to JSON for the API response. So within our Django core application here, I'm going to create a new file and it's going to be called serializers.py. Now I'm going to dive into serializers in a lot more detail in that upcoming course, but if we go to the documentation, in a nutshell, serializers allow complex data such as Django query sets and also model instances to be converted to native Python data types that can then be rendered into JSON. And you can also do this with XML and other content types, but it's most commonly used with JSON. And that's what we want to do. We want to take a query set of these product models and we want to convert them to JSON for the API response. So what I'm going to do is go down here and we have an example serializer here. And what the serializers module in Django REST Framework provides is a serializer class that you can then subclass. And you also have a model serializer that's tied to a specific model in your application. That's quite similar to how model forms work in Django. So these concepts should be familiar. What we're going to do is we're going to create a model serializer based around our product model. So at the top of serializers.py, let's start by importing the serializers module from Django REST Framework. And we're also going to import that model called product. Now, once we have those, we can create a serializer, and I'm going to call this product serializer. And what that's going to inherit from is serializers.modelSerializer, and you can see that here in VS Code. So this is tied to a model, and you do that using the inner meta class on the product serializer. And just like a Django model form, we have a model property in the meta class, and we're going to tie that to the product model in the application. And we also have fields, and these are the fields that we want to be present in the JSON response. Now we're going to want to have all 3 of these fields present, so name, price, and in stock. So let's go back to serializers.py, and what I'm going to do is paste those in here. So we now have a product serializer here, and that's going to tell Django how to take a query set of products and convert that to raw JSON data. What we're going to do now is go to views.py, and we've already imported the product model here. We're also going to import our new product serializer, and we're going to create a new view here. And I'm going to call this view product list view, and it's going to inherit from something from Django REST Framework. So I'm going to go to the documentation for Django REST Framework's generic views. And again, we're going to explore this in a lot greater detail in that Django REST Framework series that's coming up. But these are class-based views, and they allow you to compose bits of reusable behavior in a nutshell. And you can see on the left-hand side the different generic views that are provided in this module. Now, it's the concrete view classes that I'm interested in. So we have things like a create API view, a list API view, and so on. Now, the create API view, that's going to allow you to, for example, very quickly create a Django view that allows you to create a new model in your application. And if we look at this sentence here, the generic views provided by REST Framework, they allow you to quickly build API views that map very closely to your database models. So let's look at an example below here. Here we have a list create API view, and you can see some of the properties of that view here. So these kind of views, the generic views, they are tied to a query set or a model in Django. And the query set used here is user.objects.all. And we also have a serializer class, and optionally we can have permission classes as well. And this actually gives you a lot of power with only 4 lines of code. What we're going to do is we're going to use the list API view. And this allows you to provide a read-only endpoint to represent a collection of model instances. Now, if we go to our application, what we're going to do is we're going to expose the products that we have in the database. And remember, we have 3 of them. So that's going to be a collection of model instances, as it says here. So we're going to use list API view for that. So what I'm going to do is go back to VS Code, and let's go back to views.py. And at the top, I'm going to bring in another import from REST Framework, and that's the generics module. And this product list view, it's going to be a class-based view, and we're going to subclass that list API view. And I'm only going to provide 2 attributes here in order to get this working to start with, and that's the product serializer. We're going to set that as the serializer class. And then secondly, we're going to set a query set on the product list view, and that's going to be set to product.objects.all. And once we have those 2 properties on our list API view, that's going to tell this view how to take the query set of objects and convert it to JSON via this serializer class. And we also have the base query set to use here. And it's this query set that's going to be converted to JSON when a request comes in. Now, the request is going to come into a URL, but we haven't hooked up a URL for this view yet. So let's go to urls.py, and we're going to add a new path here to our URL patterns. Now, because we want a list of products, the REST convention is to have a URL like that. So /products is going to give us back a list of products. And what we're going to do here is we're going to tie that to our product list view. And because it's a class-based view, we're going to call the asView function in order to use that. Once we've done that, we can go back to the terminal at the bottom here, and I'm going to start the Django development server. And then we're going to go to the browser at localhost 8000/products. And if we go to the browser at that endpoint, you can see we now get back the 3 products as JSON data. Now, if we deployed this application as it is just now, this /products endpoint would be publicly available. Anybody can access it. And let's imagine that we have a business and we're providing this bespoke API to a bunch of clients. Maybe we have 5 clients at the moment, and obviously we're wanting to grow the business. In that scenario, we're going to want to lock down this API so that it's not publicly available. Now, the method that we're going to use to do that is to lock it down using an API key and using this package here. And if we go down to the quick start, we're going to see how to use this. And what we're going to do to start with is we're going to install it using pip into this virtual environment. Now, I think it's on version 3 now, so I'm going to use version 3, but apart from that, we're going to copy this command, and we're going to go to VS Code, and let's stop the Django server and paste that command in, and we're going to change version 2 to version 3 here. Now, while that's installing, we can go back to the documentation here, and we're going to go to the GitHub repository. I'm going to open that, and we're going to take a look, and you can see that it's got 672 stars, so this is a pretty popular package for developing and using API keys. And importantly, if we scroll down, you can see that it is on version 3. So that's the version that we're going to use. It's the most up-to-date version. Now, if we go back to the documentation and go back to this quick start, we're now going to add REST Framework API key to the installed apps. So let's go back to settings.py, I'm going to minimize the terminal, and if we go to settings.py, we can add that just below REST framework. So I'm going to paste that in here. And finally, we need to run the migrate management command. And that's going to be python manage.py, and we're going to run migrate. And the reason for that is because our new package is going to add some database tables to the application. Now what's happened here is that it says there's no migrations to apply, and that's because I copied the database.sqlite file from the preparation I'd done for this project, where we have 3 products in the database already. So what I'm going to do is open the database again, and let's have a look at what's been created here, or in this case, what already existed. It's this table right at the bottom. It's an API key table. So I'm going to show this table. So if we click that button here, you can see that this table exists, but it doesn't have any rows at the moment. That makes sense. We don't have any API keys in the project. Now what I'm going to do is close this, and let's start the Django admin. And we're going to go to the admin, and we're going to see the page that's created by the REST Framework API key package. So let's start the server by running the run server command, and we're going to go to the Django admin console. Now I'm on the Django admin, and you can see at the top there is a section for API key permissions. We can click this and we're taken to a page where we have a list, but at the moment it contains 0 API keys, as it says here. At the top right, we have a button that allows us to add a new API key. So this could happen manually. For example, if a client signs up to your website and you want to give them access to an API, you can give that a name, and I'm going to say client number 1. We also have a Boolean field here, whether or not the API key is revoked. And of course, if it is revoked, clients cannot use it anymore, and that cannot be undone. And optionally, you can also set an expiry date. Now I can just save this, and if we go back, you can see the API key has been created here. At the top, you get a one-time message with the key. And as it says here, this needs to be stored somewhere safe because you're not going to see that again. So what I'm going to do is just copy this for reference. And I'm going to go down to this key, and if we click the key to go to the detail page, you can see the details here, the same ones as we added for the name, but you can see it's got a prefix as well. Now the API key consists of 2 parts. There is a prefix, and then there is a second part, which is 32 characters, and that's a secret key. Let's go to the documentation for this package, and I'm going to go to the user guide. And in fact, I think the details about the key are on the security page. So you can see that the API key is composed of those 2 items. We have the prefix and the secret key. Now the way that users are going to make requests is by adding this API key to the HTTP request. So if we go to this section on the user guide on making authorized requests, what they do is they pass the API key in the authorization HTTP header. And that has to be formatted like this. So we have an authorization header, and then we have API key, and then whatever the value you got back from the console, that can be put in there as the API key value. Now, as well as being able to create and manage keys on the Django admin, you can also do it programmatically, and that's using the API key model. So you can import that as you can import any normal Django model, and then you have access to the methods such as .objects.count in order to interact with the API keys that are stored in the database. And if we go back to VS Code, and if we look at the API key table one more time, you can see that after creating this, the API key is now stored in the database. Now we have a column here with the hashed value of the API key. So that's called hashed key. And that's important. The API keys are not stored directly in the database. So that value we got back from the Django admin, it's not stored as a raw text value. It's treated in the same way as user passwords in Django. In other words, it's going to be hashed. And that is so that if someone gets unauthorized access to your database, they're not going to get all of your client's API keys. Instead, they won't be able to determine what those API keys are because they've been hashed like this. So that's just a note on security. Let's close the database table. And we're going to move on, and we're going to see how we can restrict this API endpoint that we have here for the product list view so that it requires the usage of that API key. And that's very easy to do using this package here. So what we're going to do is go to the section on setting permissions, and Django REST Framework API key, this package, it comes with a permission class called HasAPIKey. And that's going to protect a view behind API key authorization. That can be set globally if it's going to be applied by default to all of the API views in your project. And you'll do that using the settings.py file. And we have a REST framework setting, and you can set the default permission classes to the HasAPIKey permission. Otherwise, you can do this on a per view basis. So when you create a class-based view with Django REST Framework, you can set the permission classes field on the class, and that's a list with all of the permissions that we want to apply to that endpoint. And in this case, we're going to set it to HasAPIKey. So let's actually do that. We're going to copy this import and we're going to go back to views.py. Let's paste that in at the top. So now we have a HasAPIKey permission, and within the class, we're going to set the permission class's attribute to HasAPIKey. Now, if we go back to the browser and we go back to where we fetched the products, this API endpoint /products, now that we've protected it with HasAPIKey, if we refresh this page, you can see we no longer get the response. Instead, we get a message here that we don't have the permission to perform that action. So we can no longer send requests here unless we add that API key to the HTTP authorization header. So that was noted in the documentation under making authorized requests. We need to add this header. So how are we going to do that? What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to go back to VS Code, and there's an extension that I'm going to use here, and that extension is called REST Client. So let's go to the extensions tab, and I'm going to install the REST Client extension, or rather I'm going to show you what that extension is. I've already got it installed, but this allows you to basically make requests to API endpoints, and you can add things like HTTP headers to the request. And we're going to use this extension a lot in the upcoming Django REST Framework series. So in order to use that, what you do is at the root of the project, you can create an api.http file. And in fact, I think this can be called anything as long as it's got the .http extension. And then we can add some code for an HTTP request into this file. Now I'm going to go to the documentation for the REST client. And what I'm going to do is go down here. Now you can look through the main features. I'll leave a link to this below the video. But what we're going to do is go down and we have a usage section and some example usage here. Now you can see how to send requests. You have the HTTP method and the URL, and then you can specify the HTTP version that you want to use, and also things like content type of application/JSON. So what we're going to do here is copy this header, and I'm going to go back to the .http file and paste this in. Now we want to make a GET request, and we're going to change the URL here. It's going to be HTTP, not HTTPS, and it's going to be localhost 8000, and I need to make sure that I've spelled localhost properly here. So localhost 8000/products. And remember that corresponds to what we had in urls.py. So we created an endpoint here /products, and that's the one that's going to use the product list view. So if we go back here, you can see just above this, there's a little icon here, a little link that allows you to send the request. So when we send that, we get back the detail message here, and we can see that authentication details have not been provided. So what we're going to do now is show that we can add that HTTP header. We can add an authorization header here, and remember the syntax, it was API key, and then the value that we had for the key that we got back from the Django admin when we created that new API key using this package. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to paste this in. So I'm going to paste in the API key that I got back from Django admin, and I'm going to save the .http file. So this time when we send the request, you can see we get back the data. And that's because we've added the API key to this HTTP header. And that means that the Django server is going to accept that we can send a request for this data, and it's going to return the response accordingly. Now, if we change the API key just a little bit here, for example, changing Y to Z here, and we save this and send the request, again, we're not going to get back the data because now the API key we've got is not valid. So let's change that back and save this again. And again, if we send that, we get back the data. Now I want to also show that we can revoke API keys. So let's go back to the Django admin console, and we have our key here with the name of client 1. Let's assume that client 1 has stopped paying for our API, and we're not too happy about that, and we want to stop them using this API. If we tick the revoked checkbox here and we save this, we can go back to our API console here, or rather we can go back to the .http file, and this time when we send the request, again, we can't get the data because this time the API key that we are passing here in the authorization header has been revoked. It's no longer a valid API key. So just by using this package, Django REST Framework-API-key, we can give API keys to our clients, and we can programmatically create those as well as create them through the Django admin. And we can also view and revoke those API keys at a later date. And you can imagine a scenario where, for example, if a client signed up for your API product, you want to automatically assign them an API key. You can do that by using the API key model. What I'm going to do just to finish the video is clear this here, and we're going to go to the shell plus terminal. And at the bottom here, what I want to do is query for the API key. Now let's go back to the documentation for Django REST Framework API key. And we're going to go to this section on creating and managing keys. And this is the model here. It's called API key that we want to import. So let's import this at the bottom here, and we're going to paste that into the terminal. And remember that any model represents a database table in Django. So this is going to map to the underlying API key table. So when you create an API key, it's going to store it in that table. And we can use normal types of queries here, such as API_key.objects.all. And we can see we get back a query set with that single API key that we created. So that's just a final thing here to show how we could create this programmatically, and that could be done as a webhook in response to someone signing up for your API service, and perhaps you would email them the key or you would send them the key via some other mechanism. Now if we go back to the documentation, I want to just show a couple of extra things before we finish the video. I'm going to go back to the section on making authorized requests. We've seen that we use the authorization header here by default, but you can also set a custom header here using a setting. And the setting here is the API key custom header setting. So you can set that to whatever you want the header to be that's going to specify the API key. And finally, if we go to the customization section, and this is a bit more advanced, if you need to customize your APIs or your API keys, you can reference this section here. For example, if the built-in API key model doesn't fit your needs, you can create your own, and you can see an example of that here. In order to do that, you subclass the abstract API key model, and that's an abstract model in Django. You can subclass that, and it's going to add all of the normal fields, but you can then extend that with additional fields, and that's very useful if you want to link your API keys to other models in the application. So by a foreign key or perhaps a many-to-many field, you can do that by subclassing the abstract model and then adding your new fields here. And in this example, we have an organization model in the application, and each API key is linked to a parent organization by subclassing abstract API key and adding this foreign key. So that's all for this video. We've seen how to install and use Django REST Framework API key in order to protect our API endpoints and make them require that API key to be sent in an HTTP header. And we also saw some different features that were added by the package, for example, the Django Admin integration, and that allows you to create, revoke, and view keys. And of course, you can only view keys when you initially create them, and that's for security purposes. The actual key that's stored in the database is going to be hashed so that your database is secure if anyone gets unauthorized access. We also saw the programmatic model for the API key that allows you to query the database and create keys, for example, on the fly using Python code. And importantly, to protect API endpoints, we saw this HasAPIKey permission that's added by this package. And you can add that globally to protect all of your API endpoints, or you can add it on a per view basis. And finally, we saw how to attach the API key to an HTTP authorization header in order to actually send a request that Django can then accept and return a response because it can see that valid API key. Now I'll leave a link to the documentation on these sections, but that's going to be all for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. And if you want to support the channel, we have that coffee link in the description. And very soon, we're going to be releasing that Django REST Framework series, so stay tuned for that. Thanks again, guys, and we'll see you in the next video.